I'm going to show you how to build a simple 8 foot by 8 foot place structure using dimensional lumber with minimal cutting. I'm using pressure-treated lumber for everything. Because I have an older kid, I'm using 12-foot long 4x4 posts with almost 4 feet buried underground so that I can have a 5 to 6 foot tall platform. If you're making something shorter for a toddler, you could get away with 10 foot or maybe even 8 foot 4x4s. I'm using 2x8 beams to hold the joists up and 2x6 joists. Everything is 8 feet long. I'm using 12 5/8 inch 4 inch long galvanized lag bolts to support the beams on the posts, and 8 5/16 inch 4 inch long galvanized lag bolts to support the end joists. I'm using galvanized joist hangers with 1 1/2 inch long and 2 1/2 inch long structural screws to make it easy for me to disassemble the play structure in 5 years when my kid outgrows it. You'll also need at least 6 8-foot 2x4s for bracing and measuring while building the structure, and they will be reused as railings and corner braces once you have the structure built. All of my lumber was pressure treated. You could omit that on everything except the posts if you plan on staining and waterproofing it well, but I don't really recommend it. Now here are the tools you're going to need. To put the posts in, you're going to need some digging tools: a post hole digger, a shovel, and some clippers if you encounter small roots. You're going to need a drill with some 3-inch deck screws for temporarily connecting braces together, a good-sized framing level to make sure your posts are upright, a tape measure is always useful, and you'll need a carpenter's square for making sure you have the corners right. You're also going to need something to mix your concrete in, a way to carry and measure water, a hoe to mix the concrete, and a razor knife makes opening the bag easy. Because we're using dimensional lumber without cutting it to size, it's very important that our 4x4 posts are precisely spaced. To make sure of this, I set up 4 of the 2x4s as a ground square. If you pre-drill holes in the ends, it makes it less likely to split when you connect them with deck screws. I recommend pre-installing the screws so they're ready to go when you need them. You need to square up the corners. Either measure diagonally across the corners to make sure they're equal, or use a square if a tree is in the way of your measuring in the middle. If you are installing around a tree, there will be roots. You want to poke the ground with a long piece of metal to try and avoid them. You'll probably have to reposition the square every time you find a new root. Try to get the tree somewhat in the center, but it's fine to offset things a little if needed. Just make sure that every time you move it, you square the corners and check for roots again. Mark these corners using either spray paint or a peg or just a rock. Then remove the frame and start to dig. You will need a tarp or a wheelbarrow to keep your dirt. Keep in mind we'll need to put some of this back around the poles later on. You'll want to remove the plug of sod with the first 8 inches of dirt and roots with the shovel. You might need a saw or clippers to cut through smaller roots if you're building around a tree. Don't bother using your post hole digger until you are happy with the location of all 4 holes. After you get the first hole down to a foot or so, dig your next hole. If you find any major roots, you may need to shift future holes, so don't bother going too deep in this exploration phase. Because I don't want to cut lumber to fit my posts, I set my first 2 posts into their holes and reattach the ground frame to get the last 2 holes exactly lined up. I marked my 3rd and 4th holes with metal stakes because the centers had shifted slightly, then dug them out down to about a foot long. Once you get all 4 holes in place, the frame can tell you where within these larger holes to use the post hole digger to get the final pull positions exactly right. Also make a note of which of your 4x4s are ugly, and think about which hole to put the ugly ones in and which direction to face them so that the ugly sides are pointing inwards or away from the primary sight lines. Now you have to dig each hole down to 1/3 of the length of your posts. In my case, since I had 12-foot 4x4s, I was aiming for 4 feet. But the holes on the downhill slope were closer to 3.5 feet so that the tops of the poles would be close to the same height. If you're digging through sand, you may have to pour water into the hole to keep the sand from falling out of your post hole digger before you lift it out of the hole. If you are less lucky, you may need a digging bar to break up harder soil, rock, hardpan, etc. Don't forget to remove the tags from the end of the post before dropping them into the hole. Sometimes having a helper makes moving large pieces of pressure-treated lumber easier. Use the post hole digger to make the hole for your second post. I used two 2x4s to hold the first post upright while connecting it to the base of the second post with another 2x4 to get the distance between them exactly right. I also had another 2x4 going off to my third hole to get the rotation of the first post correct. You'll have to measure with your ground frame again to get the exact positions of the third and fourth pole as you go around. Now that you have all 4 holes fully dug and lined up, it's time for some concrete. Start with one 80-pound bag split between the bottom of all 4 holes to keep the post from sinking. I recommend you set your first post with concrete and let it dry a day. Then you connect it to all your other posts with the ground frame and the upper rail to make sure the distance between them is right for your dimensional lumber. You'll still need to brace each post and make sure it is upright and level in both directions. In addition to the quarter bag at the bottom of each hole for vertical support, I used a full bag around each post. Follow the directions on the bag very carefully with respect to how much water to add. You shouldn't be able to see any water in the mix unless you tamp it down to bring water to the surface. I just used the end of my hoe to tamp it down into the hole. Definitely re-level your post at this stage, as it's the last chance you'll get. I hope you kept the dirt you got out of the hole, as you'll need a little bit of it to fill the top of the hole. Don't forget to tamp the soil down. I only brought 6 2x4s, so I had to remove parts of my ground frame to reuse as supports. If you buy 8 2x4s, this wouldn't be an issue, and they're relatively inexpensive. If your helper is taking a nap, I've found that temporarily attaching a small 2x4 block to one end makes things easier. As you work your way around, don't be surprised if you are off by an inch in height, even though each individual 2x4 is very close to level. Take your time readjusting boards until they are all level and meet up when you connect the loop. Note that if your ground isn't level, you can have a significant height difference from one side of the platform to the other. We'll eventually cut the top off of the tallest post to level things out. Measure each post top down to your level set of boards to find the shortest post. We'll base all of our measurements off of the shortest post to make sure there's enough room at the top for all the posts when we get done. I'm setting up this 2x4 along the bottom of where my first 2x8 will go. These 2x8s are the beams that will hold up my 2x6 floor joists. I'm using 3 5/8 inch lag bolts into each 4x4 to hold the beams up. The small bit is for a pilot hole, and the large one is 13/32 to match the bolt body. This is how far the 4-inch bolt goes into the 4x4. I'm setting up the 2x4s on each side to make sure that the 2x8 on the opposite side is level and the same height as the first beam. I'm setting the 2x6 joists 1 inch below the top of the 2x8 beams, so that the top of the deck boards I'm going to use are level with the 2x8s. Make sure to pick your best 2 joists as the outer joists, as they will be the most visible. The outer joists are bolted onto the 4x4 upright posts using 5/16 lag bolts. All of the inner joists will be hung from the 2x8s using joist hangers and structural screws. I'm aiming the holes for the smaller lag bolts between the 5/8 inch lag bolts from the beams. And this is what it looks like once the full square is done. Now you have to decide on the spacings of your joists. If you don't have a tree in the middle of your platform, you are free to space them evenly. 16-inch centers are a standard width if you are going to be using plywood flooring. I hang the joist hanger to the 2x8 beam with a single 1 1/2 inch structural screw. Then place the joist, before screwing it in the rest of the holes. The 1 1/2 inch screws are used here to keep from sticking out the other side of the beam, but you need to use 2 1/2 inch structural screws for the holes that go through the ends of the joist and into the beam crosswise. I chose to use 12-inch centers because I'm going to use deck boards without a plywood subfloor, and it lined up the joists around the tree a little bit better. If you're going to be using reclaimed pallet wood for your flooring, you might even go a little closer together, but keep in mind if they get much closer together than 12 inches, access can be tight. I used a longer board across the end joists to make sure that everything was at the same general level while installing the inner joists. If you have a single tree that is less than 18 inches wide, you can probably just put a slightly larger gap where the tree is, going up to about 20 inches. Anything bigger than that and you'll need to get clever and box the tree. You can use extra joist hangers and cross pieces to hold up joists that need to be cut around the tree. You want to give at least 2 inches of clearance around your tree to allow for growth. I built my platform just high enough to snake a joist through a Y in my tree. The placement of this joist was exclusively determined by the tree. If you are worried about not having enough clearance as the tree grows, you can cut a small amount out of a joist. Just keep in mind that you are weakening it. I'm not terribly worried about this cut as it's small, and if this joist were to break here, the Y in the tree would catch it and prevent a catastrophic collapse. I decided to wash and stain my support structure now, because I'll be using composite deck boards that I don't want to stain later. I'm also doing it before adding in my corner braces, so they will be a different color. If you want your corner braces or flooring to be stained to match the rest of the structure, put this off until the very end. I'm using a spray gun here to make the job easier, but if you don't have one, a brush or roller works just fine. In my next video, I'll show you how I do the corner bracing and put the platform floor on.